Hey, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Katie Dar. I chair the US Biosphere Network's Communications Committee and I coordinate the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the US Biosphere Network's Biosphere Bites series. This is our last one of 2024, so we appreciate you being here with us. As you know, these 30-minute talks provide a dedicated space to support regular exchange and learning across our national and international networks. And these talks are all recorded and will be posted on the US Biosphere Network's YouTube page if you want to access it again later or share with folks who couldn't join live. Our usual Zoom housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute if you're not presenting or asking a question during the Q&A. You're welcome to put questions in the chat as they arise. I'd also welcome folks to introduce themselves, and if you're tuning in from a biosphere region, where that is today. Today we are joined by John Boakye-Danquah and Maureen Reed, who will be speaking to us about applying equity, diversity, and inclusion in biosphere regions and what they've learned from working with Canadian Biosphere Regions. So definitely an area we're eager to learn more about in the US Biosphere Network. John is an adjunct professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. And John is an interdisciplinary social science researcher focused on governance and co-production of ecosystem services in small-scale forestry landscapes, EDI in the natural resource sector, and assessment of socioeconomic impacts of resource extraction. Maureen Reed is a distinguished professor and UNESCO chair in biocultural diversity, sustainability, reconciliation, and renewal, and assistant director of academic of the School of the Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. Maureen's work addresses gender inequity in forestry, intersectional analyses of the impacts of climate change, and the structure and procedural inequalities embedded within planning and assessment processes. So Maureen and John, I will pass it over to you to present.
Okay. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's lovely to meet some other biosphere buddies, and I have worked with biosphere regions in Canada since about 2000, so it's been a while, and I've always really loved learning from them and seeing the kind of passion and commitment and tremendous work that's going on within each of the biosphere regions. It's just amazing. So I've always found that to be incredibly inspirational to my work. John and I have prepared a presentation, and I was going to ask before we got started, and I forgot. I think we've split it about in half. So I will begin to tell you a little bit about what sort of what we've been doing and what we've been thinking about in relation to Canadian biospheres. And I'm hoping that there'll be time afterwards as well to field questions that you might have. So I think the best thing might be, John, is there anything that you want to say? I can share my screen just so that you know.
No, I think, yeah, you can share or continue from there.
Okay. So you'll see here that the logo for Transect. So I also currently am leading an international education project around building professional, relational, and intercultural skills with students and researchers and practitioners so that they can become more effective in doing collaborative research in sustainability. And we have three main hub countries that are Canada, Germany, and South Africa, although there are increasing involvement from people in Ghana as well. And we have had students and researchers now from about 10 different countries participating. And we work with people in biosphere regions to help build these professional skills and to really understand that when we're managing for biocultural diversity or we're managing for sustainable development, we're also really thinking about how we work more effectively together. And so it's from this project that John and I came up with the idea of how can we also build what we in Canada call EDI, in biosphere regions. And thankfully, we approached Kate, the executive director in Canada for Canada's biosphere regions, and she has been a willing partner in this work as well. So we'll give a little bit of background. I'll talk about some of how we define the terms and whatnot, and some of the motivation. And then I'll turn it over to John, who worked with another colleague to do a first preliminary desk review of what biosphere regions in Canada are doing, some of the initial findings, and where we're going to be taking our next steps. So this is really the beginning of a project. It's not the final results at all. And we kind of take our inspiration from the UN Sustainable Development Goals and that phrase of leaving no one behind. And when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it really fits into the goals around gender equity and reducing inequalities more generally. John did some looking, and these are some often the kinds of common assumptions that we make, that whether it's with biospheres or whether it's within universities or other kinds of organizations, that we don't discriminate, we serve everybody, we're an equal service provider, our doors are always open. And what I used to commonly hear was, we've always invited them to our meetings, but they just don't show up. And what is sort of not said, I guess, in these kinds of narratives is that there may be other kinds of barriers in bringing people together to understand how can we serve people, how can we have more diverse people around a table, how can we ensure that people are treated with a sense of respect and belonging, so they feel that they're included in what is going on in their communities. So that's almost irrespective of biosphere regions, but it's not exclusive of them either. And we are using this term of EDI. It's commonly used now in Canada, particularly in government circles, but there are others as well. So around gender equality, that being sort of the first entree into this work, where we focused more attention on providing equal opportunities for women and for men. But as we move into that EDI space, recognizing that there are others who are also typically either excluded or feel marginalized in certain kinds of spaces, and we need to ensure that we are welcoming them into the work kind of places. And biosphere work is the same as any other in that regard. Nevertheless, we're also seeing more promotion of justice and thinking about EDI as a step towards justice, not just for excluded groups, but for everybody. Or also, we're now also seeing accessibility as being part of that. So with the acronym of IDEA, that we need to really focus on persistent barriers to accessing opportunity. And what we're saying in this particular figure is that the terminology generally is evolving. And so what we, if I were to come back to you in a year or two, some of those terms might be different as well. So as we're learning more, we're trying to ensure that what we say is respectful and inclusive and encouraging that diversity. Sorry. So just to, we don't know where everyone is at, so we thought we'd put everybody on the same page by talking about these three terms. So when we think about the difference between equity and equality, you can see in the figure that equality typically focuses on ensuring that everybody has the same opportunities, if you will, to be able to, in this case, reach the apples. However, that assumes that everybody is starting from the same place. So that when we focus on equity, we recognize that people have a range of attributes and they may need different kinds of supports in order to be successful. And that's what's demonstrated in the second illustration. Diversity really thinks about how do we embrace the multiple kinds of talents, backgrounds, skills, ways of knowing, and ability to bring different groups to the table. And inclusion focuses on how do we create environments so people want to join? How do we ensure that people feel like they are respected, they're welcomed, and they're valued for the diversity of perspectives and talents and experiences that they might bring to a particular project or initiative? So this particular series sort of reinforces the message that we know that there are multiple barriers for people to be able to participate literally on an equal playing field in this case, right? So we see people watching the game, and there's a structural barrier that affects three people in different ways. And that some of them are getting certain kinds of supports, if you will, to watch the game, while others are not. Equality suggests that everybody gets those same supports, but you can still see that there is not equity because they're not all equally able to see over the fence. But if we're focused on equity, we really try to understand what are the supports people need to ensure that they have an equal opportunity to look over the fence. And in the last one around justice, we think, well, do we really need that structural barrier? Can we actually ensure justice by removing the barriers that cause people not to be able to see the game? So those are some of the key distinctions that we make. And I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to take us through the next set.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen, for providing the context to our conversation today. So another context that I want to highlight is that anytime we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, based on history, socioeconomic status, and so many other different considerations and the data that we know, there are some groups that we know historically they are marginalized or need extra support. And so, Maureen, you want to go back? Okay. So we took inspiration from the Employment Equity Acts of Canada. And so we have what we call equity denied. Sometimes they say equity denied or equity deserving groups. And so these are communities that we know based on data, history, and other considerations that these communities, they identify barriers to equal access, opportunities, or resources. And these are due to historical disadvantages and discrimination. And they tend to actively seek for justice. And so they are, based on the Employment Equity Act of Canada, they could be, they are, in the context of Canada, Indigenous people, racialized groups of visible minorities, women, QSL, LGBTQI+, and then people living with disabilities or mobility needs, and people experiencing poverty or low income. But I must say that depending on the context, the issue that you are looking at, these categories might change in terms of who could be considered equity denied or equity deserving. And so this is also just an example of the graph on the right that seeks to show the proportion of women in Canada's forest sector. And so as you can see from 96 all the way to 2021, it's currently up to 19%. And this is based on the Statistics Canada Census Survey. And so in the context of forestry, when you are seeking to improve equity for all, women will definitely be a consideration, because if you look at their total population in the Canadian context in relation to their population in forestry, then that there is a case to make that these are equity denied groups in forestry, and that what are the barriers that we can remove to make forestry accessible for women. Next. And so there are several motivations for pursuing EDI for biosphere reserves, having set the context. I think at a very high level, what we can say is that it's the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do. There's a moral or ethical justification. And that has always been the primary motivation for a lot of these things. But beyond the moral or ethical motivation of being the right thing to do, there are also evidence of several other examples of why it is important to promote EDI within any context in relation to including biosphere reserves. So based on data that we know, organizations that foster diversity are more successful with working with a variety of different audiences. And based on the data, we know that it does foster a high degree of engagement, productivity, and innovation, especially with the people that you deal with and the constituent that you are working with. Within the context of employees, we know that it does increase employee engagement and satisfaction, and it helps in better decision making and also much more effective partnership. And I think these are all things that are important in the context of biosphere reserves. Next. So we know that based on what biosphere reserves do in terms of the way they are structured and what they do, some possible areas that we can apply EDI within the context of BR could be just the employee diversity and inclusion in terms of belonging and representation in terms of who is there in decision making in the governance space and the people that work. So that is one level from the HR related perspective. And then you can also look at it from the board, the management, and looking at how people are represented and how that affects the kind of decisions that they make. But then we can also go beyond that to look at the operational decision making, procurement, material supplies, partnership projects, and even the spaces that are available that people are interacting with. Who is there and who have less access to these spaces, and how can we create or make access easy for people? So these are possible areas that we can apply EDI within the context of BRs. Next. And so what we sought to do was to do a preliminary understanding of how Canadian BRs are embedding equity diversity in their work. And this is based on purely on data from the website. So there's no, we didn't talk to anyone. It is based on the information that is available on the website. So with the support of Krenda, a colleague of mine that will work on this report. And so that's the QR code where you can get a report, a full report from, but we can also share that with you after this. So briefly, what did we find based on the desktop review that we did? I'm going to go through very high level. So the whole approach was just to understand EDI, how it's embedded on the websites of BRs and other conservation organizations. But for the purpose of this work, I'm just focusing on the BRs work. So we look at the website of BRs. We also did look at the periodic reviews, nomination documents, and other documents that may be available. And then we use such terms like equity, diversity, equality, inclusion, accessibility, justice, minority reconciliation, SDG 5, and SDG 10. When we look at diversity, everything was in relation to humans and people. And so we didn't look at the ecological side because we know within BRs they do other things. So we look at mostly in relation to people. So what did we find based on the work that we did? Just to say that there are 19 BRs in Canada, and so the work focused on these 19 BRs and the website that is available at the time that we did the work. So what did we find? So the first thing that we tried to look at in terms of the representation of equity denied groups or equity deserving groups, how are they represented on the website of BRs? And so based on the analysis of the website, the most common groups that BRs tend to refer in the context of Canada are Indigenous people. And I think this is really appropriate in the context of Canada because of the inherent right that most BR landscapes are located in areas that Indigenous lands. And so Indigenous peoples, Indigenous youth, and then women, they were the most commonly groups that were referenced in relation to projects that were being done. Now, the groups that were least included on the website by any work that was being done was people with disability, racialized or minority groups, older persons, and then 2SL LGBTQ+ were the groups that were least represented on the website. And then we also look at the earlier terms that I spoke about in terms of reconciliation, diversity, inclusion, and the other terms that are available, SDG 5, SDG 3. On the websites of the BRs, the most common reference was through reconciliation in relation to Indigenous. It was the most common across all the BRs. And we know that this is rooted in historical and ongoing relationship between Indigenous communities and BRs, but also the broader Canadian community. So reconciliation basically seeks to address and heal the deep-seated wounds caused by colonization. So it was the most common. Over 80% of references. Diversity was next, around 66, and was mostly in relation to diversity of staff or economic opportunities within BRs. There was also the point about inclusion, more in relation to staff, and then equity, somewhat related to pay equity gaps, and then accessibility. And then we also look at a document. In terms of the document, what are the most common groups that were referenced in the BR document are periodic reviews. And I must say that because the periodic reviews, BRs are responding to very specific questions, the reference were mostly to youth, women, indigenous peoples, and visible minorities. Next. So what is this data telling us at a very high level? So based on the work that we did, I think what we are learning from this early work is that most BRs are at the early stage of EDI journey, where the focus is primarily on awareness and recognition of its importance, and then also a much more focus on staff, volunteer hiring and practice and on the boards. So more on the HR and the governance piece. A few BR have strategically integrated EDI into specific areas of operation, like funding decisions or community engagement. And then there is less information available on how BRs can strategically integrate EDI into their core operations or core delivery service, especially in relation to the three core functions that BRs mostly focus on. And then finally, it is also important to recognize that EDI is contextual, and that although we use the same approach to assess what they are doing, what each BR might be doing might be quite unique based on the area that I find themselves in, the history. But we do know that there are some broad general considerations. For instance, what are the equity deserving groups? They are much more general. But EDI is really contextual, and what might be relevant to one BR might be very different from another BR. Next. So beyond this, I think this is an early work. And so we are seeking to directly engage with the BR organization to learn really in terms of, because on the website, I think not all information might be available, and there might be something that is going on that is not on the website. So we are seeking to do further work and directly engage with BR to learn about the ongoing initiatives, any opportunities, any challenges that they are learning, and also examine where there are opportunities for BR to adopt EDI principles to enhance their mandates and the core operational areas that they seek to work in. So this is really, what we found. But if you want a more detailed analysis of the report, that is, you can look at the QR code. But we're also happy to share the bigger report where you find all the analysis and a much longer version of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Maureen. I'm sure there's a lot of folks itching to get into the discussion about this, and thank you for linking that report. We'll include that in the recording description on YouTube. Yeah, I'm gonna just hand it over to the crowd to get started on questions. Kelly, you might have something to start with. I'll pass it to you first.
Well, thank you so much, John and Maureen. I've been really looking forward to this Biosphere Bites for a long time. So we're honored that you took the time to meet with us today and to share this important work. So I think that, as you said in your presentation, that we're all on our kind of, EDI journeys. So it was really interesting to see how you're looking at this in Canadian Biosphere Regions. So again, kudos. I just wanted to share that John Allen, Cliff McCready, and I are working with a University of Michigan student from their School of Sustainability and Environment, Elena Smith. She's doing parallel research on analyzing gender equality in US biosphere regions. So she's looked at periodic reviews in a similar format, has found some very interesting things. I actually have a meeting with her tomorrow to discuss her early findings. And I think, to your point, it's really interesting how on a national level this shows up, but also in biosphere regions. And so if it's okay, I'd love to connect you with her, because I think that the findings speak to a larger issue around how we're at, like, the periodic review language and how we're talking about gender and equality and equity in biosphere regions. So, and Elena is, I think, again, very parallel to what you're doing. So again, thank you for this great presentation, and we look forward to continuing to hear more about it.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, sure. Definitely be happy to connect, with a student doing this work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great.
So I put in the chat around the idea of this kind of further exemplifying the concept that we're working with within the Canadian network of, like, some of the 19 are early adopters or early starters, or the leaders, and the rest of the network is able to learn based on their success. But I would also add in that like Maureen holds a UNESCO research chair, and there is a number of them in Canada that have applicability to biosphere regions, but Maureen is able to kind of take the work that she's doing and really apply it in a practical way into biosphere regions, and or the biosphere regions can help influence the work that she's doing. So she's a really valuable partner at John as well, to kind of bridge that gap between the like high level academics, which to be honest, a lot of time goes over my head sometimes, but have that like practical applicability to what it means for biosphere regions. So just a thank you as always to Maureen for being such a supporter of Canadian Biosphere Regions and the work that you do.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all on, as Kelly pointed out too, that and John, we are all on this journey. So we're seeing that within, the university where I work, and we're seeing that in the organizations we work with outside of the university, and biosphere regions are just one of them. And so I think there's ways that we can learn from other BRs, but there might be ways that we can also learn from other organizations that have done some of this work. And some of it as well, I think, is also lies with UNESCO, because as John pointed out, the first review that we did was sort of that he did, I guess he and Krenda, was this document review, and they need to be asking the right questions. Right. For in some cases. So sometimes that's why we need to start talking with the BRs directly, because sometimes work is being done that may not be as visible as well, or there might be some strategies that we can learn, that we can share. And having these conversations, I think, is really important. But having said that, I'm now on an international panel. I guess it's a tri-country panel between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, looking at climate change and biodiversity. And we're thinking we'll get this report done before, huge political winds change. But it's interesting because I'm one of the contributing lead authors, and so is Leah Besser, who is also UNESCO chair and a friend to BRs. She's in a different chapter. I'm in chapter 1, which is kind of the introduction to the whole thing. But we have brought in a young person, person of color from the United States as well, to support some of the EDI work that needs to be done in the report. And that's not my doing. That's the doing of the people who are really leading this initiative. And so I think we are starting to learn that this is important, and it's important for how the regions really represent their regions. Canadian BRs have done a huge amount of work on the reconciliation file, working with Indigenous peoples in the areas where their territories lie. And that's been a journey so far of about 10 years at least of really hard work. And so this is not something that will be done overnight, but yeah. I also know Parks Canada has done a fair bit of work, and I'm wondering whether, Katie, you mentioned that a lot of the BRs in the United States have national parks at their core, and whether that's same with the US Park Service, I don't know. John?
Yeah, and I don't have an answer to that specific question, but there were a couple of things that came up that you mentioned. It's really fantastic work. We are just starting to talk to some of our US related UNESCO chairs also. We've had 1 or 2 conversations, and we really want to dig into that network more, where we see both regional and intellectual overlap. So anything that we can do together to help facilitate that would be fantastic. So thank you for bringing that perspective. And also our deepening our relationships of not just the US Canadian side, but with our Mexican colleagues too, as we sort of lie in between those 2 relationships. The other thing is the young person you said you brought on to work on some of this work. I'd love to introduce them to our youth network. We have a youth board, and I'd love with Janelle Booker's work there and the whole team's work. Would love to make them aware of this work that's being done, in this case by a U.S. individual. So I think that would be another one of those connectivity pieces. That's why these Biosphere Bites are so important to us. the question I had is a little bit differentiating. And John, I really appreciate your work. And I think if you looked across the US, you probably see something similar with a lot of reference, more reference of late, at least to Indigenous outreach and engagement. Many of our biospheres, not all, but many. And part of that's regional, right? Southeast, Southwest would be doing work, and Hispanic and communities from that. But we also have biospheres that are sort of in and of themselves kind of related to the storylines of diversity equity. For instance, Congaree in South Carolina, which is very specifically around African American traditions, culture, slavery, and so I'm wondering, quite frankly, how that sort of shows up. It's on their website, at least the UNESCO one, but it sort of differentiates between what they say they're doing and how they talk about it and what they're doing and the work that they're doing to reflect. And I just want to make sure that we sort of understand that differentiation. I think your point's well taken that if we look deeply, there's probably more things happening, and certainly on the US side within the park system as a whole, at a national level, the work on DEI, whether that specifically shows up in the language of the biosphere or not, is one piece. And I think we have a lot more work to do there, but it's not so separate from the larger context of the organizations that they participate in. For instance, for us, for Abtawayang, which is in northern Michigan, all of the organization, all the 50 some partner organizations are all working on a variety of different aspects. So the partners are, whether it specifically shows up within the BR structure is a whole nother question. And I think that's a fair distinction that's hard to get at a little bit.
I'll hop in, and Kate raised a great question in the chat, and I think it's really worth like bringing up. And Cliff McCready and I, when we attended the MOB ICC meeting this past summer in Morocco, it was really apparent that EDI globally is very different than it is in the US and Canada. And so, as John mentioned in the presentation, we keep saying everyone looks at the importance of this vastly differently. You know, we had talked about, the reason that came up was they were talking about the name change. And so, Kate, I'd shared with you before, it was really sobering to Cliff and I. Cliff and I had raised our hands and said, you know, on behalf of the US, we think that we should consider the name change away from man in the biosphere to be more inclusive. Our Canadian colleague also spoke up. So Jean JP from Manicouagan Biosphere, we were the only two that spoke up. And it was really sobering to see that on the global scale, when you have a designation like this, the complexities to the way that we approach EDI. And so it was quickly shot down. The name change was voted against. So the conversation about how and when EDI is going to be integrated into the next action plan, I think is going to be pretty contentious. I think that, you know, and to Maureen's point earlier, even on the documents of periodic review, the questions around gender inclusion, you know, I was part of the committee that reviews the periodic reviews, the International Advisory Committee, and also the new designation forms. And when we talked as a committee to review those, you know, the level of importance around that, even around the table of 12, was very different, you know, from a US perspective to, you know, South Korea to, you know, Czech Republic was super different. So I do think we have to still continue to speak up about the importance of this, even though we might be alone. And I think that was a really sobering thing to Cliff and I to send that meeting and realize we were alone, and also JP. But I think from the Canadian US side, that it's something that we share in common. We should continue to look at that and continue to advance this. And maybe it becomes something in our own documentation and our own research that we show the importance of. Mm-hmm. So it's really powerful. And again, just emphasizes the complexity around these international designations and executing them in really different cultural, political contexts. So I'll just add that piece.
I would say sort of also USBN, I mean, we were not in UNESCO, then we're now in UNESCO, and we may or may not be in UNESCO. Who knows, right? Without a national committee, let's put it that way, the entirety of the US cohesion is around this volunteer network that we run, the US Biosphere Network, and providing sort of the basis of DEI, EDI, right? This effort has been a little bit complicated relative to the cohesion that a national committee could provide or the instructionality that a national committee could provide. We will take up and have taken up that mantle, but doing that through the lens of our volunteer organization versus some sort of federally recognized entity under the UNESCO structure does differentiate this a little bit for us. I won't say it makes it harder, but it makes it different. And we have to respond to that difference. And really, as we continue to learn from you and the Canadian experience, and to Kelly's point, how the rest of the world thinks about this. I mean, we thought it was sort of a no-brainer. Man in the biosphere does not resonate well within our community. Certainly doesn't resonate well with our student groups that we work with, right? In fact, they hate it. But to be met with such silence on the international stage was a bit of an eye-opener for me, quite frankly. I thought that was kind of a no-brainer, and there it was, right? Two to however many against.
And that's interesting because some of the historical work that I read, I was reading complaints in the 1980s and 90s about the terminology.
Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, it's really interesting that it's still so resistant between that and even reserve, I know, has also been a contentious term as well for different
reasons. We've dropped that by practice, not by fiat.
Yeah.
We've dropped it. We've used the word region because we think that's more illustrative of a set of relationships than some kind of fence.
Yeah. I attended a workshop, I guess it was last year or earlier this year, on EDI more generally, and she made a really interesting point. And it doesn't matter whether it's EDI or DEI, the I is always at the end. And she said, if you want, in a sense, diversity is the easiest to measure, right? You can kind of do some counting of it. But she said, if you want to be effective in equity and diversity, you actually have to start with inclusion. As organizations, you need to think about what are your practices and are they inclusive? Are they bringing people in as opposed to, certain kinds of barriers that probably inadvertently leave people out away from the table. So I thought that was a really interesting observation. So.
It just can't be an IED. That's a different thing.
Maureen, that was powerful and it's going to stick with me. So I appreciate you saying that. I had dropped earlier a resource in the chat from the Sonoran Desert Biosphere. And the reason it's I'm actually here right now in Arizona, and I went with my family to visit. It was interesting because the Park Service in Oregon Pipe was very kind to give us a tour of the site and the biosphere and the cultural work they're doing around DEI in that region to integrate the community, the Mexican community, the Native community, and then also the work that they're doing with the biosphere more broadly. And what was interesting, to end the tour, they drove us to the wall. So that was the portion of the wall that was actually built on the US-Mexican border. And it was so interesting because the biosphere is it's bordering, it's part of the biosphere, it's really touching the biosphere. So it was really interesting. We're looking at this idea of DEI, and the fact that we have a wall built in one of ours was really, mind-opening to me. And I left there and it emphasized the importance of the work that Aaron and his team and the International Sonoran Desert Alliance, that's the link I put in the chat, is doing. And that I think that we think about more broadly. Yes, we might not have a wall in our backyard in our biosphere, but to our point, and what we've been talking about all today, is integrating, like Maureen said, leading with the inclusive part first and making sure that we have that representation. And what does that look like in all of our different biospheres? So this is a timely and so valuable conversation. Right. So deep gratitude to Maureen and John for organizing this.
But some of our tribal people in other places do have that wall, right? Whether it's Haudenosaunee or other communities that now live on both sides that are either in or both or right, and other circumstances. So we do have to recognize sort of the transboundary nature of some of these relationships, right? As not just physical manifestations, physical walls, physical barriers, but also sort of identity barriers.
Really rich discussion. Thank you, Kelly. I took a note of that as well, the report. So I've got it.
Maureen, if you're willing to share at some point, hoping we can follow up a little bit. And the name of the individual in the U.S. would like to connect. I think you mentioned it was a she, but or her to our student network, our youth board,
Oh,
and just to make sure so our youth board's well aware of the work that's happening in the 3 countries. I think would be really important. We
yeah,
also
I think it's Jasmine Brown, but I'll double check her last name.
yeah
And
yeah
she's
yeah.
she works primarily, she's a forester and she works primarily in forestry. And so that's what where she's coming from. She's a PhD student and I've forgotten where now, because we only ever meet on Zoom. So, and I've only met her a couple of times, but I can double check and send you. Is there
Love that.
is
We
there
love that.
some person, like Katie, would you be the person that I could email to get other email addresses for
Yep.
others who are here?
Let's do that. We got to start giving Kelly a little break here. So, because I'm watching the clock tick on her tenure with us.
Speaking of clocks
Sure, have
ticking,
Kelly do it.
I hate to be the one to draw these rich conversations to a close, but I do want to recognize our speakers, and all of you have stayed
Yeah.
well over our normal 12:30 end time. But I think what we've learned is that there's a lot more discussion to have about this, and I think we'll have this on the table for future Biosphere Bites topics and dig into some of the work that our other biosphere regions are doing, and perhaps do one of our longer form biosphere buffets so we don't have to cut this off in the future. But thank you so much, Maureen and John. We really appreciate your time.
Right.
Thank you.
And to all of our friends on both sides of the border that joined us today. Thank you for that. It really is meaningful for us to continue to travel this path together. So thank you for your guidance, your leadership, and your insight.
We'll see you January 22nd for our next Biosphere Bites. We're taking a bit of a break for the holidays and the new year, but looking forward to it in 2025. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Excellent presentation.